Well, we started a new series last week calling it The Story of Us. It's an overview of the entire Bible, starting in Genesis, and we're doing a sort of bird's eye view of the Bible as we fly over looking for the big themes of Scripture. Not just focusing on individual stories, but looking for the grand story, the big story. And last week we started with this question, why did God create the world? A good question, a big question. And Jeff and Sid Holsklau were up here from Chicago to kick that off. Did you guys like Jeff and Sid? Some of you here last week? What I didn't tell you was that Jeff and Sid are two of the people that are exploring with us the possibility of this pastoral job we have open right now. I simply told you last week that he was a professor visiting from my seminary, which is true, and a great Old Testament teacher, which is also true. But I didn't tell you that Jeff and Sid were also considering the pastoral job here at Vineyard Grand Rapids because, well, for one, they already pastor a church. And though they have the sense that God might be drawing them here, and we're exploring that together, they hadn't talked with many people at their church and even in their own family about it yet. But also, I thought that it might be better to tell you afterwards, so this didn't feel like one of those strange television dating game shows that we talked about a couple weeks ago. But that we just have a regular atmosphere. And because we're not interested in people performing for us on Sundays or performing for an interview, putting on a show for us, we're interested in who people really are. And so some of our leaders knew that last week, but today I want to tell you that we're considering them for that role. And in fact, we have the feeling that maybe God has sent them on this journey to explore this with us. Over the last couple of months, they've sort of come out of nowhere. They weren't expecting it. We weren't expecting it. And God seems to be speaking in some different ways. So we're exploring that now among our leadership teams. And many of you guys filled out the survey a couple weeks ago and just helpful feedback on what we need for a pastor, for youth and family and discipleship and some of these things. So thank you guys for just contributing to the discussion and the discernment process, and just invite you to continue to be in prayer with us for this. Some of our leadership team just had this sense, 3 different people said, we just feel like God would have us pray these people into this role, whoever it is. So I encourage you, be in prayer this week. We are just full steam ahead with that hiring process. And thanks for, if you've got thoughts from last week, just share those with me as well. You can drop me an email. But today we're going to continue on in the series, and I want to focus on the question, last week, why did God create the world? This week, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? And we'll look again at Genesis 1 that we covered last week, just to answer the question, what is it that separates us from the beasts? What is the defining characteristic that makes us human? And you know, that the answer to that question has changed all throughout the ages. In the ancient times, they thought the defining human characteristic was spirituality. I worship, therefore I am. In the Enlightenment age of reason, Descartes reasoned, I think, therefore I am. As maybe you've heard, I think, therefore I am. In the industrial age, it was, I work, therefore I am. I produce, therefore I am. And at different points, the romantics and literature have said, that's nonsense. I love, therefore I am. I love. Now, what is it that separates us from the animals, from the beasts? I mean, the age of psychotherapy, many would say, well, I feel, therefore I am. But I think we've moved past that. We're in an age not defined by work or reason or spirituality, but by social media, right? I mean, what does the social media age say? Well, I trend, therefore I am, right? I have followers, therefore I am. I get likes, therefore I am. And if you have kids, you've seen this, from about age 5 now, kids are learning how to talk right into the camera, how to create YouTube television. Older people sometimes say, well, that's ridiculous. Who's raising their kids that way anyway? Well, it's not those kids. Those kids are just a mirror of the world we've created, aren't they? They're a mirror of us. The world of social media is just the world of TV celebrity for everyone. And adults do it too. We call it things like personal branding. Anybody have a personal brand out there? Anybody know what personal branding is? Yeah, well, if you don't have a personal brand, or if you don't know what a personal brand is, you'd better get one. They say, if you want to get a job or you want to get a date, you need to get a personal brand. And, even if you're not working hard at your brand, we live in an age that's really, I'd say, hell-bent on crafting a self and creating a self, creating an identity. And we live in the age of self, in which to be human, for many of us, for much of our society, is to have a self, to have a unique self. And if you want to, if you want to know what it means to be human, many today would say, well, you need to look no further than within yourself. Take a deep look inside yourself. And because maybe, you'll find that you're a firework, and, maybe you'll tell me how much you're worth. I mean, those kind of things, we believe there's this inner spark of divinity in us. And, at least since the time of Shakespeare, the Western world's been saying, to thine own self be true. Have you heard that one? To thine own self be true. I mean, we don't say it that way anymore. We just say, you do you. You do you. You're not sure what you're supposed to be doing in your life? Well, you do you. You're not certain what people think of you? Well, you do you. You throw off the restraints of other people's opinions. Just you do you. And there's something very empowering about that kind of language, or can be, but there's also something very frightening about that language. Because what if you do you, and you find out you're just not that as impressive as you thought you were? What if you do you, and you find out you don't like what you find? What if you do you, and you find that you don't really spread good things in the world, but something uglier, more sinister? I mean, you do you turns out to be a pretty heavy burden to bear for humanity. And you do you, staying true to oneself, is a heavy burden to bear, and it's a burden to bear because it's really more of a religious belief. It's more of a religious system, a competing religious system. You do you. Look within yourself. Find yourself. Be yourself. It's a religious system. And if you doubt that, we could do a little thought experiment here. I mean, if you doubt that that's the religious system of our day, let's do a little thought experiment. In the early church, they had this interesting problem. They had this problem of Jews and Jewish people and Gentiles who'd come to follow Jesus and were having a really hard time being in the church together, because they brought together with them wildly different values and backgrounds and family histories. And when they tried to come together as one new family of Christ in this thing called church, it was just like oil and water. Like, it didn't mix. And let me give you an example of that. When I was a kid, my parents used to take us down to Amish country. You guys been down to Amish country? And when I was a kid, they brought us down there for fun, but when I was a kid, there was nothing fun about it. I mean, maybe for them, not for me. My folks loved the old way of life and the simpler pattern of making quilts and furniture and flea markets. I don't even know what that had to do with anything. But they would take us down there on vacation, and as a child of the 80s, a child of like the video game era and Steven Spielberg movies and electronic 80s music, I just hated everything about Amish country. To me, the Amish were like an offense to almost everything I valued. Their customs were obnoxious. I look at them and think, what do you think, you're better than me? I'll show you better. And I remember one time we actually took my grandparents, had one of those 50-foot big RVs, and we drove down there, and it had one of those like hydraulic steps that comes out when you like open the door, and I felt like I was in like Back to the Future. Take it now, Amish people. It's like, and that's how Jews and Gentiles looked at each other. As Christians, they knew, well, we're supposed to love each other, but we just can't stand each other's culture. It's offensive. It's just wrong. That's the Jews and the Gentiles, and Jewish and Gentile Christians in the early church. And to a group of people like that, Paul says in the letter to the Roman church, which was a mix of Jewish and Gentile background believers, he says, "Let us therefore no longer pass judgment on each other." Well, that sounds good enough, right? But then he says, "If your brother or sister is being injured by what you eat, you're no longer walking in love. Do not let what you eat cause the ruin of one for whom Christ died. Let us then pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. It's good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother or sister stumble." And then he goes on not just to talk about food, but about holidays they celebrate, etc. So let's do a thought experiment. When you think about, as a modern American person, Christian, when you think about how you're living, what you eat, how you party, let's say maybe what you wear, what you drive, what you post on social media, do you think first about whether a brother or sister might be injured? Do you think that? I mean, most of us don't. Not me. I mean, if you're one of those especially sanctified people, then God bless you, and I'm glad we have you in this church. But personally, I kind of feel like I shouldn't have to ask that question. Like, because what I wear and where I go and what I do and what I say, well, that's my prerogative. And if you don't like it, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out. I'm going to do me, you do you. I mean, this is where most of us are living. And when we think about how we're living, when we think about self-fulfillment, when we think about our choices, we're thinking about self-pleasure, authenticity to ourselves, self-fulfillment, self-satisfaction. We don't often think about acting in love, not with our personal style. And we think about what makes us happy, not so much what might injure a brother or sister. And we don't call it self-centeredness. We call it, nicer sounding things like self-care. I'm going to do me. You do you. But fundamentally, our choices are all about me. That's the culture we're swimming in. Because individualism, individual pursuit of pleasure, satisfaction, material wealth, individualism is our idol. It is the American idol. And it's very hard to recognize your own idols. Idols are what we worship. Idols are what we pour money into, what we shape our calendar around. It's what we aspire to and we dream of. And you may know this if you've read any of the Old Testament, that much of the Old Testament is just concerned with the prevalence of idol worship, the temptation, the constant temptation for the people of Israel towards idol worship. And you know idols, right? Those 3D figurines, or the statues maybe, the larger ones, or the representations of a god. That's an idol. And when you read the Old Testament, you find that there's really nothing that seems to make God more angry than idols, idol worship, which is kind of odd because, of all the things to be concerned about, why idols? Why, bowing down to a figurine or a statue? When we get to 10 Commandments, we find that the first two are about idols. You shall have no other gods, and don't make idols, don't worship them. Which would seem to be pretty simple, wouldn't it? Like the first two commandments are pretty easy. No other gods, no idols, especially when you think about 5 to 10, like honoring your father and mother, adultery, murder, stealing, lying, false testimony, envy, and covetousness. I mean, those are the hard ones. I've always been baffled. Like, why are 1 and 2? Why does that seem to be where Israel continues to fall over and over and over? I mean, remember the stories, like when Moses gets the 10 Commandments and he comes down off the mountain. I mean, he's just gone for a minute. And what are the people doing? They're melting down all their shiny items into this golden calf. Why? I mean, it's so strange, isn't it? Like, why the temptation? Why would anyone want to worship a golden calf? I mean, what would it take for you to worship a golden idol? I mean, suppose that you believed that the golden calf wasn't just a beautiful spiritual object, but suppose you thought it would protect you. Suppose you thought it would provide for you and set you apart from other people. Then might you worship a golden idol? I mean, what would it take for you? What if you believed the golden idol would bring you national security, as Israel did? I mean, that it would grow the economy, that it would make you first and greatest among the nations. That's what the ancients believed. What would you sacrifice if you believed the idol would bring you true love, a meaningful career, better lifestyle, well-being for your kids? What might you sacrifice? Because the power of idols is not in what they are, it's what they represent. It's what they represent. And a lot of the Old Testament concerns this problem of idols and idol worship. And that's why we get these purity laws and the laws against intermarriage with other cultures and prohibition on settling amongst pagans. That's why so much of the Old Testament's concerned with idols. It makes you kind of wonder, what is God's big problem with idols? Like, why is God so worried about idols? Have you thought about that? Of all the problems in the world, why the golden statues? I mean, is God simply jealous? Are idols really that much competition to God? Is that really like the most damaging thing in the world? I mean, is God just envious of these statues? Well, that's not quite it. It's not quite it. Because in Genesis chapter 1, as we read last week, we actually discover right from the get-go the problem with idols. In Genesis 1, after we read last week about God creating the universe, and it, of course, begins with the Spirit of God hovering over the chaos, over the waters, and God calling forth light from darkness and separating out and creating all of creation, the animals and the plant life and all of it. And after that's finished, verse 26, it reads, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." A few verses later, chapter 2, we read, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." And what's really strange about that passage is that the modern translations say, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." But the word image is the same word that almost everywhere else is translated idol in the Old Testament. Tselem, image, idol. And because idolatry is such a bad thing in the Old Testament, we use a different word when it comes to this, because we don't like to think of ourselves as idols. But what the text is actually saying is, God said, "Let us make man in our image. Let us make man our idol." We are the idols of God. And that's a different thought for a lot of us. I mean, why would Genesis describe humanity as God's idols? Last week, Jeff and Sid pointed out that the whole of the creation narrative in Genesis, it contrasts to ancient pagan religions. The ancient pagan religions from Mesopotamia to Babylon to Egypt, I mean, every one of them had an idea about where creation came from. All of them had a creation story, and most of their stories started out the same: water and chaos. Creation starts with water and chaos, and then the gods often at war, and something emerges from that. I mean, the ancient pagan cultures believed that the whole universe was full of gods. I mean, the sun and the moon and the stars are gods, and the plants and the animals there's gods lurking everywhere. And so ancient pagan people built temples for their gods to dwell in and rest in, and they formed images or idols out of the dust. They put together these idols, some gold, some clay. They built these idols to put in the temple so that the God could come and rest among his people. And ancient pagan priests believed, actually, that they could breathe upon these idols and animate them in some way. Now, they didn't believe the idols were gods themselves, but in these ceremonies that historians call them spiration ceremonies, like the modern word aspirate, And they've actually found in the Easter Islands, some of these statues, they found evidence of these spiration ceremonies where the priest would actually, when these gods were consecrated and put in a temple, or in this case on the shore, the priest would read the creation narrative, and then they would breathe on the idols and animate them, bringing them to life, because they believed that God's Spirit would somehow fill that idol, such that when you are in the presence of the idol, you're in the presence of this or that God. And if you desecrate the idol or violate it in some way, it's not just clay anymore, it's the presence of that God. And I don't know about you, but I always thought that, growing up, I thought that God gave us Genesis chapter 1 to argue with evolutionists and prove Darwin wrong. The earth evolved in 26 billion years. No, it didn't. It was 7 days. I mean, that's kind of what I thought growing up. But Genesis 1 was never written to contrast creation and evolution. Genesis 1 was written to contrast creation and paganism. Paganism. In a world full of pagan temples and gods and myths, the people of Israel told a different story. I mean, Genesis 1, just right from the beginning, says, no, there's not lots of gods out there. There's one God, and he created everything. Those aren't, sun gods and moon gods. Those are just little lights and big lights, is what the Hebrew says. And those aren't great monsters in the sea. God put those there. I mean, Genesis 1 tells us that God created a place to meet his people, a temple, and so the entire creation narrative is shaped like a temple dedication ceremony. The 7 days mirror the 7 days of the 7 steps of creating a temple and dedicating a temple. And then God says, unlike the pagan traditions, this God says, according to Israel, our God says, you're not going to create images or idols for me. I'm going to create my own images. I'm going to do my own aspiration ceremony. I'm going to breathe life into my images, into my creation, and I'm going to put them in my temple where they will bear my presence in them, and they will be for me. Just as all these other peoples have idols for them, so you are to be idols to me, to tend to my creation, to bear my presence in the world, and of course to name creation, to order it, to be God's co-rulers in the world. And so we get this story of God breathing his breath. And maybe you've heard me say this before, but the word breath in Hebrew, ruach, is the same word that's translated spirit. Like there's one word, spirit and breath of God, same thing. God breathes, he fills humanity with his spirit. And so according to Genesis, finding the real you, your reason for being human, your reason for existence, it doesn't start with looking into your own self. It starts by discovering God's image in you. It doesn't start by just looking down and letting your desires tell you what you were made for, but discovering that you were created by a God to look like him, and that your very life is the breath that God breathed into you. You live because his Spirit lives in you. To be human is to be made by God, as an image of God, given life by the breath of God. And by discovering that God has created us to be that connected to him, like to be his idols, to bear his presence in the world, that you carry on his work, that gives you all the meaning in life you could ever need. It gives you all the peace and joy you could ever find to know that you were created to participate with him in his work of creation, in his rule of the world. That's what it means to be made in the image of God, or as sometimes we say, the imago Dei. That's what it means to be his idol, to be made by him, filled by him, to carry on his work and reveal him. And so the problem with idolatry is not simply that God doesn't like competitors. The problem is that God has already created idols, you and me. People to be filled by his breath, people to be his presence in the world. people that are more connected to him than we can even understand. I mean, is it any wonder that when Jesus says, whatever you do unto the least of these, you've done unto me? Because we are filled with his presence. We are God's idols. We are deeply connected to him. And when we forget about the true God, I mean, we as humans, we'll talk about sin next week in the fall, but when we forget about the true God, we as humans become not image bearers, we become the lead actors in the unraveling of all of creation. When we pour our life into creating idols, pouring our treasures and our jewelry as the people did to Moses, we pour our resources and our livelihoods into creating idols, two things happen. When we worship idols, first thing happens, when we worship idols, we as humans become dehumanized. We lose our humanity. We become broken idols, broken image bearers, warped and twisted. I mean, when you worship anything other than God, you become dehumanized, subhuman. And second, when we are warped and twisted and dehumanized, we begin to dehumanize others. And our brother becomes our enemy. I mean, according to the Bible, you look at any atrocity in the world, and it begins with the worship of creation rather than the Creator. As Paul says in the start of the book of Romans, he says, we exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles, idols. And therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity and the degrading of their bodies with one another. We exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served creative things rather than Creator. And the result was God gave us over to depravity and wickedness and evil and greed and every kind of depravity. I mean, according to the Bible, you look at any of the atrocities in the world, and it begins with the worship of creation rather than Creator. And in a way, it's as if idolatry sucks the life of God right out of us, sucks the breath of God, sucks the life right out of us. It dehumanizes us. And it causes us then to suck the life right out of others. Have you noticed that? I mean, you wonder how in Genesis, evil progresses from, apple picking to brother murdering brother, like in a couple chapters. You wonder how it progresses then to genocidal retribution in a few more chapters. It's because idolatry sucks the life right out of us, and we begin to suck life out of others. I mean, you wonder how Israel, generations later, rescued from Egypt and oppression and slavery in Egypt, they begin to enslave and oppress other people. How does that happen? It's idolatry. I mean, you wonder how people in our own age, seeking a better life in the new world in America, you go from pilgrims and explorers to genocidal murderers of Native Americans. It's idolatry, the worship of created things, security, wealth, power. I mean, you wonder how nice, average German folks, just trying to make their country great again, begin sucking the life out of Jews and disabled people. I mean, how does that happen? It's idolatry. I mean, you wonder how reasonable people rationalize aborting babies in the name of freedom. It's idolatry. And you wonder how a country could justify tearing children out of their mother's arms at the border. It's idolatry. It's the worship of created things, the worship of security, the worship of wealth, of power, privilege. I mean, it sucks the life right out of us, and we become so subhuman that we begin sucking the life right out of other people. And it doesn't matter what the idol is. I mean, you worship success and power, and you'll find yourself using people. Even pastors do that. We want a big church, want a successful platform. So we just churn through people. I mean, you find yourself worshiping security. And I mean, you'll murder. There's no lengths you won't go to keep you and yours safe. You worship money, and you'll find yourself hoarding, taking what's not yours, just sucking the life out of others. And that's why it just simply won't do to define humanity with words like, you do you, I'll do me. Just be true to you. I mean, you don't like refugee kids? Well, you just do you. You don't like Jews? You do you. That philosophy fails us. The best picture I've ever seen of the life-sucking power of idols comes from that wonderful Christian kids parable. Remember the one? Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban? I mean, it's kind of an open secret, but there's probably no author in the last 20, 30 years who's done as good a job at illustrating biblical concepts as the series of Harry Potter does. I mean, it's in the series there's this creature or something, this monster known as the Dementor. Some of you know the Dementors, and the characters fear the Dementor's kiss. And it said that they were glistening and grayish, these slimy-looking, scabbed beings, like something dead that had decayed in water. And where there should have been eyes, there was only thin, gray, scabbed skin stretched blankly over empty pockets. But there was a mouth, a gaping, shapeless hole, sucking the air with the sound of a death rattle. And it says on one occasion, Harry could smell the Dementor's putrid, death-cold breath filling his own lungs, drowning him. Dementors are among the most foulest creatures that walk the earth, the narrator says. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Get too near a Dementor and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. If it can, the Dementor will feed on you long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You will be left with nothing but the worst experiences of your life. Beware the Dementors. I mean, the problem, according to the Bible, is that the evil in this world has sucked the life and the breath of God right out of us. I mean, we are alive, but only barely. And according to the Bible, we need so much more than just self-help, or enlightenment. We need more than personal empowerment and motivational speeches. According to the Bible, humanity needs a rebirth. A rebirth. And that's why the gospel writers tell a story much like Genesis 1 of how the world gets reborn, of how the world begins again. And one of the best is right in John 20, right after the resurrection, John chapter 20. We read that early on the first day of the week, it's the new week, the new world. Well, it was still dark. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed. And so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple and said, "They've taken the Lord and we don't know where they've put him." And then he begins appearing, the first day of new creation, the first day of a brand new world. It says on the evening of the first day of that week when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them. And he said, "Peace be with you." And after he said that, he showed them his hands and his side. He showed them the worst that evil in this world could do. And again he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Not you do you, but you do me. I am sending you." And with that, it says he breathed on them, and he said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." He breathed on them the life that had been sucked out of humanity. He breathed on them again, just as God had done in the garden with the first of humanity. And the world was reborn. And still, it is being reborn. Because Jesus didn't just do this once and for all. He breathed on them and said, "Be filled with the Holy Spirit." And then he said, "As I've been sent to do this, now I'm sending you." And so, friends, for those of us who've experienced Jesus, our task is not simply to wait around till he comes back and to live good, upright lives. Our task is not to protect ourselves from the world. It's to go into all the world, breathing the breath of new creation, breathing out the Spirit of God, breathing out life to other people. And our words have that power. I mean, perhaps you've noticed that just as the words that are lacking in our lives can be filled by God. Have you noticed that? When you experience the Holy Spirit, it fills up that which is lacking. And maybe it's the words that, you never got to hear a parent say. Maybe it's the words, you hoped your kids would say one day, and they've gone off. Maybe it's the words you long to hear from a spouse. Maybe it's the words you long to hear, good job, from a boss that never come. We have been commissioned to speak the words the world is longing to hear, the words that bring life, the words that fill others up, such that people would have one of those experiences like, the movie depictions of those who are drowning. When they finally come to the surface, say, that's the picture of the good news we bear. So I want to show you just a clip here from a film, Son of God, that just depicts this after-resurrection experience the disciples were having of Jesus. And after we do, we'll worship. Oh, yes, go ahead.
No, this isn't real. Thomas, stop doubting. And believe.
Let's stand and respond together in worship. Lord, you are our shepherd. We will lack for no good thing, for you take us to the pastures that are green. You lead beside still waters, bring refreshing to our souls, as you guide us in the paths that make us free. Lord, you're our shepherd. Lord, you are our shepherd. We will lack for no good thing, for you take us to the pastures that are green. You lead beside still waters, bring refreshing to our souls, as you guide us in the paths that make us free. Lead on. Lead on. darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. You give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. And it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. Sing, you give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. Spirit down on us. And great are you, Lord. Yes, great are you, Lord. We want to invite our ushers up to collect our offering right now.
You guys can go ahead and do that because I want to invite some of you to receive prayer. Just go ahead. When we turn our worship back towards the true and living God, we open up space in ourselves for God to breathe back into us the life that's been missing, things that have been taken and sucked out of us, empty parts of us. And there's just a special time when we're opening ourselves up to Him in worship and turning our thoughts back towards our Creator, where God meets us here in a special way that words don't, sermons don't, but God does by His Spirit. So I want to just invite some of you to say yes to Him. Some of you who've felt that there's an emptiness, a longing to know God. You've felt like the life's been sucked out of you, especially if that's you. I think everybody's hands are pretty well by their side right now. So if that's you, we could just go ahead and put your hands out like this. Because I'm going to invite people just to pray for you, to pray that God would meet you by His Spirit. Just put your hands out like this. And if you're just feeling like, the life's been sucked out of me, right? There's an emptiness that only God can fill, that I would want Him to meet, right? And just put your hands out in front of you to receive. There's probably more of you. When we slow down like this, we just become aware of hunger in us, the need to be filled with His life. If that's you, just put your hands out. We're going to wait for a few moments on just the Spirit to come and meet us. You become aware as we're waiting of just a need, an emptiness, a longing, a hope. Just even a hope that you would have a longing. You can just put your hands out. Invite some of you who are around them just to pray for them, and not just pray to God to move in them, but you'd actually speak some of the words that God would put on your mouth. What is it you see when you look at them? Just calling life out of them, speaking life over them, who they were created to be. That's what the Bible calls prophecy, speaking into being which is not, but that which God intends. If there's somebody near you with just their hands out like this, you could just begin to pray for them. Just just be real sensitive about the laying on of hands. Women lay hands on women, men on men. Some of you who feel like you've been wondering what it is you're missing, what it is you need, why your heart feels empty, you feel this longing, what it is you're really looking for, who. I believe God is saying, through one of our other church members, He wants you to know that I am the one you're looking for. I am the one that can fill you. So Holy Spirit, would you come now and just fill these men and women? Would you fill them with life, the life that's been taken from them, the words that have destroyed and brought death and just sucked the air right out of their lungs, or the hurts and the sorrows that have just caused hope to recede in them until it's no more. one of the people who just feel like walking dead